Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is currently sunny North Wales. And believe me when I tell you that that is not a regular occurrence. So it's quite celebratory here in terms of atmosphere. It's actually a beautiful early evening here, and I'm absolutely delighted to spend part of this beautiful early evening with all of you. And we have a fantastic number of people currently listening in. So hello, everybody.
It's growing.
I know. Hello to everybody, wherever you are, whoever you are, and whenever you are, because we have so many different time zones out there. Okay, so many of you already know Trish Lambert. And if you don't, then what have you been doing? Have you been under a rock somewhere? Because Trish has been around with Mythgard and then Signum for quite some time. Part of the bedrock of Signum, I think we could
there we go. I like that.
We could go ahead and say that, I think, because Trish has been around for quite some time, since the start, really, and has had a lot to do with the way in which Signum has been building over the last few years. And it was great fun working with her over the last last year or so.
Well, you also taught me in a couple of courses too, so you kind of knew what you were getting into. When you decided to be my thesis advisor.
Absolutely. Yes, I went in with my eyes wide open. But on a more academic note, some of you, by the way, will notice I'm wearing some interesting
decor. I just noticed that. Good heavens.
Yes, I know. This was from punching people. No, it wasn't. It was from falling over on the ice while ice skating with my 18-year-old daughter, who probably bounces better than I would. But enough about me. It's all about Trish tonight, and we are going to be talking about Trish's fantastic thesis, which is on a subject that has not been touched on before in Signum. So,
or probably anywhere. I wonder, actually, because I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah. I do want to actually, those of you who do know me, whether it's through Signum or through LOTRO or whatever, all of you know Buddha, my parrot. And I do want to acknowledge that his cage is behind me, but he is not in his cage because he would be adding his more than 2 cents. So to let you know, he's not flown away. He's just, he's just elsewhere. So
yes. I think Buddha is all present and all knowing, but not currently in the room.
Right, not currently in the room. Yes.
Okay.
That's true. Okay.
All right. So we've kept you waiting for long enough, and that is more than enough from me, because it is all over to Trish now. So Trish, first of all, can I ask you just to introduce yourself a little bit and just talk very, very quickly about your thesis, give us a brief overview, and explain a little bit about what led you to this topic.
Okay, well, I have been a Tolkien fan since, oh my gosh, we don't even want to talk about bedrock. I'm like the Flintstones. I mean, I read The Hobbit when I was, I think, in 7th grade, and I've just been a Tolkien fan ever since. Became, as many folks I'm sure here were, a Tolkien professor fan because I discovered his podcasts back, oh my gosh, Tori's been doing those for so long, and was on hand when he began to form, at the time, Mythgard, which then became Signum. And it was actually, I was like, gosh, that's really an interesting idea. Getting a master's degree, Tolkien studies, perfect. And so I thought, why not? And that's the beginning of, we're now at this point because of that happening. My vocation in life has been mainly marketing, so in business marketing, and also today I am now a freelance copywriter. So writing is really my passion. So that's what I'm doing as a vocation. And this whole thing with Signum has been pretty much a labor of love. The title of my thesis, and I have to look over here because it's one of those long academic titles. I would never write this as a marketer, but as an academic, you have to write long titles. The Reach of the White Hand, Literary Analysis of Stories of Dunland and Rohan in The Lord of the Rings Online. So what that is Lord of the Rings Online is a video game. It's a massively multiplayer online game. So what that means is it's not like a PS2, it's not a PlayStation thing. It's actually delivered over the web, and people from literally all over the world play in the game, and you are actually in the game concurrently with all these other players. So it's a very interesting experience, but even more interesting to me is the fact that it tracks the story of the Lord of the Rings. So as the player, as the protagonist, I mean, when I read Lord of the Rings, didn't I want to, and didn't so many people want to I want to be there. I want to be part of the story, you know, gosh, you know, fan fiction, you write yourself into the story, right? Well, Lord of the Rings Online actually puts you in the story as sort of a side helper. So you're sort of working as the fellowship is moving, you know, toward its goals. You're helping sort of clear the way and helping other, you know, societies. The thing is, when you get to Rohan and Dunland, Tolkien didn't, and the developers stay very close to Tolkien. That's one of the things I really admire about them. And I know Corey's talked about this before too. They are very conscientious about staying really true to his subcreation. So you don't get to have, you know, dragons as steeds, and you don't have, you know, you don't have a magic wand. I mean, it all works within Middle Earth and its lore and its history and whatnot. But when you get to Rohan and Dunland, especially Dunland, Tolkien didn't really write a whole lot. I mean, I think we have like maybe one sentence about Dunland. We have one word in Dunlandish. And even Rohan, other than, you know, the track through the grasslands, meeting Eomer, and then going to Edoras, you don't really know a lot about Rohan. I mean, there's not a lot there. However, when you think about it, there would have to be, you know, I mean, there would have to be farmers. There would have to be somebody tending the horses. There would have to be villages, you know, this kind of thing. Well, you know, you can imagine. And when I got to Dunland and Rohan, I was really impressed because they were fully, you know, as a business like a game would have to, right? They got to keep their players engaged. They would need to really fill this land out beyond what Tolkien gave them. But I think what really impressed me was the fact that it was all still done very much within the context of Tolkien's subcreation. And I had the good fortune to be able to interview Chris Pearson, who's the LOTRO world builder, who's really sort of the Tolkien lore guy for the developer as part of this thesis. And I was just never ending impressed. I mean, you as a Welsh person would love the fact that he actually based the Dunlendings on the Welsh Celts. Mm-hmm. And there's even a group quest in Dunland that you have to actually go kill Draigach, which is named after the Welsh red dragon. And he was really, really good about, and then the Rohirrim, of course, are Anglo-Saxons. Anyway, so the thing is, great, so you've got this land. How do you engage the players? And I found myself very engaged. So this was kind of a situation where as a player, I found myself engaged. And then I went back and thought, what has engaged me? And I realized whether they meant to or not, the developers took a very literary approach to the stories that they gave us in Rohan and Dunland. And the overarching umbrella of the stories they gave us was the impact, the unseen, mainly unseen impact of Saruman on these two areas. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of almost like they started there and said, how would these lands, how would these people be reacting to this kind of what some people think is actually benevolent force, but we all know is really evil. And they were really, what they did, whether they knew it or not, drew from literary archetypes that all of us would recognize. And so the stories they told in the various villages in Dunland and in Rohan, and the stories around the people there, they're all original stories, but they all kind of had this, well, most of them, I mean, there were a couple other stories that I pulled in too that were archetypes, but the betrayer stories were all kind of reflections of sort of how this impact would play out, and very engaging. And so I was like, when I got to thinking about it, I thought, this is really literary, and you know, they're really using archetypes. In other words, they're things that I primally respond to as the reader protagonist in the game. Very engaging. You get yourself very invested with these relationships, and it's just this amazing extension of Tolkien's work. So, you know, underlying all this in this particular game, my assertion is that video games can be literary. I mean, there's a very literary aspect to the way these stories unfold elsewhere in the game as well, but Dunland and Rohan are especially useful because they're so, you know, they're so thinly sketched by Tolkien that you know, these are really good examples of how the developers really engage the player in a literary experience. So that's mm-hmm. You know, and so in my thesis, I actually specifically look at certain stories in Dunland and Rohan, and I illustrate the archetypes by drawing from both classic, what I mean by classic is pre-20th century, and also more modern stories, to show, here are the archetypes. You'd recognize them from this story and that story, and then here it is in LOTRO, and it's, the parallels are unmistakable.
Okay, I'm really interested in what you just said about how video games are a new form of literature. Can you go into a little bit more detail about how they are?
It.
Yeah. Thought you might be.
Yeah, I think this is really what I discovered in the course of doing my thesis, is I'm really passionate about how modern day audiences interact with stories, with literature. And so first of all, I will say that I think I can confidently state that during Shakespeare's time, his plays were not considered literature. In fact, plays themselves, I don't think were considered literature. They were on the south side of the Thames with the brothels, decadent life. It was just not, academics of the time were not looking at those plays as, literature. So things change. It didn't used to be that movies were considered literature, or, TV shows even. I mean, it's been those are relatively recent additions to sort of the body of literature. And I honestly think the newest thing here is video games. Now, I'm saying, not every book is literary, not every film is literary, not every play is literary, not every game is literary, but there is a literary component, I think, to video games. I actually believe that this is one of the ways in which audiences are going to be consuming literature. 50 years, 100 years down the line, it's like with Shakespeare's plays, it's not even going to be a controversy that games or graphic novels, gosh, by that time we'll probably have virtual reality. So, we'll be actually living the stories ourselves. But I do think that this is part of the evolution. It's kind of a literary evolution, and the ways that audiences consume their stories. Mm-hmm. I think that video games are definitely now part of that collection of media, if you will. So, I have no question about that.
So where is the line then? What qualifies certain video games, like LOTRO, for example, as literature? What makes them qualify for that?
I was thinking about that this morning, because the truth is we could ask that same question about a book, right? I mean, what is literature? And I think part of it is this whole archetype idea, that there are archetypes. And actually, I'm going to just look over to the side here so I can because I want to get the definite quote from when I looked at archetype. Okay, literary archetypes. I think that's really one of the biggest things, is that there is an archetype. And then what is an archetype? Okay, good question. Well, here we go. I got it. Okay, so when I went to look at, so define an archetype, that's going to be easy. Not so easy, actually. I mean, I have found multiple definitions of archetypes, and actually, when you talk about literature, it's a very slippery term, in fact. Mm-hmm. But what I found was Umberto Eco wrote this that hits the mark for me. He said it's a pre-established and frequently reappearing narrative situation that is recycled by innumerable other texts and provokes in the addressee a sort of intense emotion accompanied by a vague feeling of deja vu that everyone yearns to see again. So in other words, it's a never gets old kind of motif that gets repeated through narratives. Now I was thinking about it again this morning, and I thought, well, I mean, you could say that that's true of a lot of things, that repetitive narratives. I think it's more than that, though. I think that this part about the intense emotion and the deja vu, it's something that really we respond to as readers. So if we think about even literature and books, not all books are literature, not all films are literature, but there are definitely those that have lived on. Shakespeare, I mean, there were plenty of other playwrights other than Shakespeare. Oh, this is the point I was thinking about this morning. So there were plenty of other playwrights than Shakespeare. Why is it that Shakespeare has come down the years? Tolkien, I think, is the same way. There's been a lot of fantasy written, yet his work is as, if not more so, compelling today as it was 50 years ago. I think there's something about genius in there. There's something about the author's genius that I don't know. I think there's probably people that have looked into this, a lot more than I have in terms of what makes literature. But I think that same yardstick, I think that whatever it is that makes literature in a book or a film is the same yardstick for a video game. I've played other games, and I've played story-based games like Star Trek Online and Star Wars: The Old Republic, and they're good games, and they're they're story-based. What I mean by that is they're based on another canon, like Lord of the Rings Online is. Not all games are that way. These are based on an already established canon, and they're good games, but I don't find them as engaging and compelling as I find Lord of the Rings Online. I don't know if it's because I have a particular Tolkien bias, but I tend to think it's more along the lines of how the developers actually developed the game. I think they did a better job, frankly, of staying true to the motifs of the canon story, but also adding their own to it. Does that make sense? Anyway, yeah. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think it's whatever yardstick we measure any kind of literature can be applied to video games.
Okay, I've got an interesting point just popped into the question box here. Phil Boswell comments that that's kind of assuming that the archetype is always positive. Sometimes we never want to see it again. What would be your response to that when you were talking about the archetypes being positive?
I can't imagine if we don't want to see the archetype again. I don't know that piece of work would end up being literature. Because people would not go back to read it. I mean, the archetype, as Echo is saying, it's a deja vu that everyone yearns to experience again. It's a motif, it's a theme, it's a concept that the reader can't get enough of, kind of thing. Think about star-crossed lovers. Romeo and Juliet. I mean, how many other stories? Abelard and Eloise. I mean, even a classic. That's an archetypal relationship that we can't get enough of. Even bad guys, even the evil archetypes, which actually a lot of what I treated in my thesis has to do with bad guy archetypes, are still archetypes that we will read about over and over and over again. So I'm not sure that there's a way of it might not be an archetype if you read it and it's like, I don't ever want to see it again. I don't know. Going by my definition anyway.
Okay, so we've got this broad background now to why you were drawn to both LOTRO and to talking about your thesis. So let's start pulling into the thesis itself. Could you go into for us what the central argument of your thesis is?
Well, really it was demonstrating this literary quality, kind of what you and I have been talking about, and the basis of my assertion that LOTRO is literary is the fact that they're using archetypes. Whether they meant to or not, they ended up using these literary archetypes. So then I actually went into the specific archetypes. And interestingly enough, I had as far as like the Saruman related archetypes, I had a very convenient source to go to for archetypes, Dante Alighieri. I mean, he wrote the Inferno, and his circles, eighth and ninth circles of hell, have the betrayers and the traitors, and it was like I could match up stories in LOTRO. I mean, it was like I wouldn't be surprised if developers hadn't gone and read Inferno before they started to write the stories. They were so well matched up. But again, I think what I'm saying here is these were archetypes, and actually Mike Drought, who was my second reader on my thesis, who's a medievalist and is a person who knows Dante, said, there's a talk about why it is Dante's persisted all this time. And actually I did find some works that said, he's persisted. He's another literary person whose genius, he wrote this allegory, yet it still is with us today, and it's still very much recognizable. In fact, one of the other sources that I used besides Dante's work is a book by Jerry Purnell and Larry Niven called Inferno. And it was like a modern day version, but it was still Dante's hell. They just had different characters and different people representing the archetypes. So those archetypes actually matched up. So for example, and I have my little list here. So for example, in the eighth circle of hell, we had the evil counselors, which I think everybody would recognize. We could probably all say it in unison, is Grima, Wormtongue. And then we had the sowers of discord, which is another one that we see in LOTRO. Now, interestingly enough, of all the archetypes that I talk about, of all the traitor archetypes, Grima is the only one in Lord of the Rings Online that we actually recognize from Lord of the Rings. Everybody else are actually characters from the game, which again for me is just a really good example of how well they did. So evil counselor, sowers of discord, those are the 8th circle, and then the traitors are traitors to kindred, traitors to guests, traitors to lord and king. We have all of those in Lord of the Rings Online. And then I actually came up with what I call the comprehensive traitor, which is sort of somebody that would like be across all of those. They'd be comfortable in all those spots. And I pulled so that the reader could recognize, yes, okay, here's this archetype. For example, sowers of evil counselor Loki from the Norse mythologies, and I use Neil Gaiman's Norse mythologies, is an example from classic times. And Sauron is a good, especially in his Anatar days and his Numenor days, was my example of an evil counselor. So it's that, that malevolent force behind the throne kind of thing. And then of course Grima, that's the most obvious one, again because it shows up in Lord of the Rings as well as Lord of the Rings Online. Sowers of Discord, Edmund from King Lear is a perfect example. I mean, he's just a mischief maker, as is Agravain in T.H. White's Once and Future King. And then in the game, there's a story where there's a guy who he's one of Grima's men, and he is basically just creating havoc, partly because he just can, so he just does it, so it's that kind of thing. I don't know if you want me to go through all of the examples here, but the point is there's like 6 or 7 stories in LOTRO that I use as examples to show and to tie to classic stories and stories that we would know in the 20th century as well that play this kind of archetype out.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming into the question board about this. Yeah, great. Timothy Fisher would like to know, what keeps an archetype from becoming a cliche or repetitious in a negative sense?
I was trying to think about that because, there's another term called trope that we use a lot. And I actually kind of agonized about this a little bit when I was working on my thesis. What separates an archetype from a trope, or what separates an archetype from a cliche? I apologize. Ranch worker on the ranch today.
Oh, that's okay. I had my husband walk in 5 minutes ago, so
okay, fine.
Just as of nothing.
At least it's not Buddha. Again, I think it's probably, I don't know that I have a really good answer to that. I mean, archetypes for me are more primal. I mean, they're more, like I say, I don't even know that the developers were aware what they were doing at the time they were making these stories. If you talk to one of those guys, they'd probably say, well, we knew we needed this kind of guy, right? And so that's almost cliche. We needed somebody who was would betray his thane. That's almost cliche, but then the way they actually created the story was much more engrossing and much more there was much more emotional investment on the part of the player experiencing the story. That may be the difference, is the ability of the author, again, back to the genius of the author, to create an experience for the reader that goes beyond just that sort of almost two-dimensional cliche trope kind of thing. I mean, think about the people that have written fantasy stories since Tolkien, right? And I would say there have been any number of authors that I've read that it's like, I didn't complete the book because of just what Timothy's saying. It wasn't an engaging, it was more cliche than engaging. And I almost wonder if that's not subjective too on the part of the reader. So another thing that creates these classics and these literature is kind of enough readers agree that there was emotional, investment or whatever. Enough people reading the work agree that it becomes literature. And I don't necessarily know. I think, one reader maybe could think it's cliche and another not. So I don't know. I think there's some popular agreement involved in that as well.
Do you think it could be a bit about, oh gosh, I'm blinding everybody. I'm going to have to go.
I know. Actually, it looks kind of dramatic. I know. It's really kind of cool. There's like this big thing of light there. It's like, it's almost like well-timed to be talking about, literature and archetypes and woo!
Anyway, do you think it's got something to do with, it's not just having, we need this kind of trope within the story, the difference between that and literary allusion, actually reaching out to those other stories, and not just having a figure, but having a resonance with those other stories. Do you think it might be something like that?
I think so. I think so. One of the other stories that I use, and it's not one of the betrayer stories. It's a story about Nurzum, who's this big monster who is creating havoc in a section of Rohan, and he's actually a creation of Saruman. So for my archetypes, it was actually Frankenstein's monster as my classic, and the Island of Dr. Moreau, which is I considered, even though it's like the tail end of the 19th century, was really more of a 20th century story. And the thing about that is when Chris and I were talking, Chris was saying that Nurzum is their Beowulf, that they actually had Beowulf in mind when they created Nurzum. Now, I actually put that as a footnote because for me, actually, the story is much more similar, I think, to Frankenstein's monster or the Island of Dr. Moreau. This creation, it's a creation of man as opposed to being a demon like Beowulf. But it was their hat tip to Beowulf, and that's kind of what they had in their mind. They had a Beowulf kind of counterpart in the story, and that's kind of what drove them. And I do think, and of course, the developers always had Tolkien as their anchor point, which I think also helps with this literary quality. They kind of quality controlled against Tolkien's subcreation. So, for them, they kind of had a leg up, where if a developer was subcreating from nothing, I think it'd be a lot more challenging to make it literary as opposed to just cliche. So I think you're probably right there, allusion back to Tolkien specifically, allusion back to Beowulf, the Dunland and Rohan, and this is actually played out in the star-crossed lovers archetype, which is a Rohirrim man and a Dunlanding woman fall in love, and of course it doesn't play out well amongst either side, very Romeo and Juliet-ish, which is my classic one. We had the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts. One of the reasons why Chris selected the Celts as the Dunlanding culture was because in history, the Anglo-Saxons basically overran the Celts historically and took their land and, pushed them out, which was what the Dunlanding's complaint was per Tolkien, against the Rohirrim. So they even pulled from history on that as well, which I think is really smart. And then, in Rohan itself, the villages that we visit, they did pretty much base on sort of Anglo-Saxon society as much as they could. What I mean by that is they made sure that there were a lot more women in authority than we may have seen in Anglo-Saxon times for the game. But that's a commercial thing. I mean, it's like you're not going to get a lot of women playing the game if you don't have women in authority figures in Rohan and Lord of the Rings Online. But I do think you're right. I think it is that harking back to, having your story sort of hark back to or filter through or however you want to say that to something else. I think absolutely.
So resonating with these other texts rather than simply taking a trope from them.
I do think, and that's the thing that I find so amazing with any piece of literature, quite frankly, but with this game in particular, is the fact that they were able to do that in a way that resonates. And we're not saying, that's like so contrived, or that's just that thing. That's just that trope. I never did. I mean, there may be people who play the game that do, but I actually became very invested sort of in all the relationships that I ended up creating through my character with all these people in Rohan and Dunland.
Okay, we've got more questions, which is awesome.
My gosh.
Matthew DeForest says, an associated archetype question says, one of the things that LOTRO resists is the standard D&D archetypes. There is no paladin, more Mallory than Tolkien, I guess, available as a player character, for example. How much do you think the literary classification you place LOTRO in is associated with that resistance?
Meaning that they actually have turned their back on sort of the traditional, in much the same way, I suppose, that I was going to say that Tolkien turned his back on, but actually Tolkien's kind of the root of modern day fantasy,
Even he was looking backwards, of course.
Yeah, even he was looking backwards. I think probably a lot of the like I said, I think they had a leg up because of the fact that they are staying so absolutely, conscientiously consistent with Tolkien's subcreation. There's a lot of things that you're just not going to see. You're not going to see the same sorts of motifs and concepts that you would in a D&D situation or in a Guild Wars type, game situation. Like I know some of the material that I researched about games, because I was actually looking at games kind of in general, just to sort of understand where LOTRO sort of fit according to sort of gamers, if you will, or game pundits into, the larger thing. Is one of the things, that's, it's not a complaint, but it's an observation about LOTRO, is you don't have magical powers. You don't get to like cast spells and special effect. I mean, there is a little bit of that, but compared to other games like Final Fantasy or something like that, it's not even close. So I think the reason, again, I think that's kind of to Matthew's point, we don't have that kind of stuff. Actually, to tell you the truth, when LOTRO, feeling the pressure to have some of that kind of thing, opened a class called Runekeeper. And they tried to keep as close as they could to Tolkien, in the sense that the Runekeeper, is like a rune expert, and they use runes to do but they do magic. Oh my goodness, the LOTRO community just about had a fit, because it wasn't, this doesn't fit into Tolkien's works. So, I guess I have to feel like sympathetic to the developers, because on the one hand, they have a leg up with Tolkien's story, but on the other hand, there's a lot they can't do, because the player community just absolutely won't stand for it. Mm-hmm. So that could also be, Matthew, the other thing is sort of almost a self-policing thing, where they're going to lose customers if they actually go D&D with Lord of the Rings Online.
Well, they are very different immersive worlds, aren't they?
Yes, very different. Very different. Mm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in fact, we've got a question about quality, for example, from Sharon Hoff. She says, do you find that the prose of the scripts written by the developers to convey the story to be of higher quality that strengthens the content of LOTRO, or is the underlying connection to Tolkien's genius that which elevates it?
Oh, that's a good question. Sharon might remember that when we were, I forget what we were, was it with exploring Lord of the Rings, or when Corey was taking Grifflet through, he was disappointed that the developers didn't use the same meter for Tom Bombadil that, that Tolkien used in his dialogue. I think that the developers have done a heck of a good job, but again, they had Tolkien to kind of springboard from. Interestingly enough, they can't really use copy from the text. They can't use Tolkien verbatim. They don't have the rights for that. They have the rights for the, they have like kind of like more the visual rights and the names and things like that, but they don't have rights to the actual copy of the books. So they have to write in parallel, kind of. So when you're going to, for example, you get to see the Fellowship off in Rivendell, and you have the scene in the courtyard when Boromir blows his horn and Elrond says, please don't do that. The scene that you experience in the game is the same scene, but the dialogue is different, because they can't use from the book. And I would say, just thinking of that scene as a good example, it's as evocative as the book is. I mean, I think the developers have done a good job of, being true to sort of the prose style and the dialogue style. I wouldn't put them on I wouldn't put them on the same level as Tolkien, just because I'm biased. I mean, he was just a master of this kind of stuff, but he kind of wrote oftentimes a very elevated prose anyway. And I don't know that would really work for a game, game, quest copy and dialogue and stuff. But I think they do a pretty good job. And I actually want to, I think my hat's off to Chris for sure, and a number of the other developers. I think they're very conscientious. Chris has shared with us that he oftentimes is like the Tolkien conscience among the developers, that if they get an idea, that's too far astray, he pulls them back in and says, no, you can't do that. And I think it's good to have that kind of QA. And I'm sure that he's not alone. I'm sure there are other developers as well. So it's nice that you have these developers who aren't just, gee, let's take this world and then we'll just have our way with it. And actually, I think lately it's even been more challenging for them, because we are in the game, we are past the destruction of the ring. And so it's almost into fan fiction now, where the developers are having to create stories that go past the end of Lord of the Rings. And I think they're doing a really good job of it, because, they're having to still stay true to the subcreation. And I'll bet you it's a heck of a lot more challenging.
Right. I'm going to bring you back to your thesis again. So were there elements that you wanted to include in your thesis, but ended up not being able to? You had to kill your darlings there a little bit.
I did. I actually did go down one road. Well, actually, there was a lot more examples that I wanted to give because as I was going through, the archetypes and going through classic stories and modern stories, there were a lot more examples that I wanted to give. But between you and Mike, you reined me in and said, we don't need a complete laundry list. And you're right, we don't. We just needed some examples to show it. But there were a lot more that I wanted to delve into. And one of the books that I really wanted to include and actually had developed quite a bit on was American Gods by Neil Gaiman, because that's actually an Odin Loki story in modern day terms with Wednesday and Loki Lysmith. And for a long time, I had that story in my thesis, as this great parallel to Saruman and Wormtongue. And I had started to really go down this road of comparing Wednesday and Loki Lysmith to Saruman and Wormtongue, and because their relationship in American Gods is actually different than in Norse mythology. It really is more of a Saruman-Grima kind of relationship. And then I started to expand that out and say, gee, dastardly duos. There are others like Morgoth Sauron, during the first and second ages, or first ages. And I thought, gosh, I bet there's more of that. So I sort of got a little bit deviate. I started to go down that road, and then it was like, no, this is just not on track. I can't do it. So I did have to kill my darlings, unfortunately. I still got the notes, and someday I may do something about dastardly duos in literature, but it is not this day.
Sounds like a paper topic to me.
I know, it is a paper topic.
Okay, well, I mean, on that idea, so besides this dastardly duos idea, were there other topics that you came across, you stumbled across during your actual work for your thesis that you'd like to take further somewhere else?
Let me see if I think I made some notes. I wrote some stuff down. Well, just being able to get more into the archetypes was really the big one, besides the dastardly duo. I really kind of wanted to delve further into this, and I would have loved to have actually expanded maybe even more to show other examples in LOTRO, because it's, the quality that I'm talking about here, the use of archetypes isn't just limited to Rohan and Dunland, but I'll tell you the other one that I thought that I really enjoyed, and I went into a little bit of detail on this, but I really liked the fact that there was a lot of thought going into how would a land be impacted by the influence of somebody like Saruman. And this is it was too far off topic for me to go into much detail about, but how would there be, where there's one Grima, there's going to be more than one. There's also going to be people that are misguided, thinking that Saruman really is benevolent, and maybe and they see that their king is hurting, and that the land is hurting as a result of their king being compromised, and many don't realize that Grima is doing what he's doing. So you've got these factions, that different people are going to have different opinions, and then also in the Dunland side too, which Saruman has basically holds sway over all of Dunland. They're basically his resource for so much of his armies and whatnot. The problem is this more went into sort of almost sociology or history more than it did literature. To talk about the way that the developers really thought really well about what kind of impact would that have on a culture and on a people. So that kind of got me a little bit sidetracked too, but then I had to come back and go, that is not literary. That is something different.
So it sounds like you learned quite a lot just from the process of writing this master's thesis. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely did. I mean, I think my idea with even the archetypes, I don't even think going into it, I realized it was as thorough as it was. I mean, this whole idea of there being this very, primal recognition, Campbell kind of talks about it when he talks about archetypes and his comparative mythologies, that there's these motifs that go across cultures and things. And it was that. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I had really, I think I underestimated the extent to which those motifs and concepts show up in literature, not talking about comparative mythology, but talking about literary works, and how, you can reach back into Greek plays even and see these same motifs. It's just amazing to me. So that was really interesting. And And then in the game itself, really, I came to really recognize a lot deeper things to admire in the game. You know, I mean, it's a game, yes, but it's also, I mean, this was outside the realm of what I studied, but an example that I use in my footnote is I cry every time Theodred dies. You're actually with Theodred when he dies at the Fords of Isen.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you how many players I've taken through. I cry every time because the storytelling is so good that the developers do, that you have this relationship with Theoden's son that when he dies, you're just devastated. I mean, I can't believe I cry every time. So, you know, I was just, again, reminded of how engaged they're able to make me anyway. And I think a lot of folks that play LOTRO, you know, we just get really engaged with the stories.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that I learned probably at a new depth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of producing your thesis, what would you say was the most challenging aspect of that for you?
I wrote that down. What did I say? What did I say about that? Challenging. Oh, yes. No, this was very challenging, I felt. There's not a lot, there was a lack of academic resources about Lord of the Rings Online, and actually kind of games in general. What I did find in academia related to games in particular were not literary. I think I kind of referred to this obliquely when we first started out. I don't know that there has been another academic work treating a video game in a literary context. The academic works that I found had more to do with audience perception, had more to do with the ludic aspects, in other words, the game playing kind of mechanics of the game and how audiences related to that. So it wasn't really looking at the literary, specifically at the literary pieces. So that was a little bit challenging. But the good news is that I then kind of expanded out and started to look at the academic works around Jackson's films. And interestingly enough, a lot, and the one that comes to mind in particular is Dimitra Fimi wrote an essay about the folklore attached to Jackson's films. And I found that what she described there very much applied to LOTRO. So a lot of what's written about audience reception to films, or how the films got put together, or what works in the films, or that kind of thing, it really applies to LOTRO. So fortunately, I was able to find you know, good literary treatment of the films that I felt I could you know, in good conscience move over to the to the game. But it was frustrating at first to not be able to find a lot of literary treatment of this game, or any game really, for that matter.
So we have more questions in the question board. Yes, more questions. Okay. Well, a couple of comments actually. First of all, from Phil Boswell. I thought I'd pass along to you. He says, "We're going to have fun in a little while when Grifflet reaches Wildemore."
Oh, indeed. When Grifflet takes on Ner'zhum. It'll be a true David and Goliath story.
He also comments that for him, the dialogue in the game seems more realistic, not having been cleaned up by Findigil, etc. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would. I think it's probably more natural. It hasn't been sifted through Findigil and Mary and whoever else, you know, decided to polish it up. Yeah, it's more in real time sort of thing.
So I've got another question from Matthew DeForest. He says, part of the study of literature, head canon aside, is the shared experience, a common source text shared by its readers. How does the ability of a player to tell their own stories within the context of the game impact your work?
You know, I kind of talk about that. I'm going to test this and see if this actually hits what Matthew's talking about. One of the things that Dimitra talks about in her treatment of the films is the folklore of the audience. And what she means by that is that the audience, and this is actually something this is actually something else that I learned, was my passion for this particular topic, is how the viewing audience, how the reader audience or the viewing audience in turn then impacts the root story. So for example, her example in the Lord of the Rings movies was the character of Figwit, which is Frodo is great, who is that, right? And it was just this extra standing behind Elrond during the Council of Elrond, but the audience reaction to this elf actually turned it into a character. You know, became a character of Figwit, right? And the same kind of phenomenon is happening in Lord of the Rings Online, and I say I kind of refer to this in my thesis, is that the player population has actually added lore or added cultural tidbits to Middle Earth as a result of their playing Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings Online, I'm not sure how much Tolkien would appreciate the fact that, it's pretty well known that rangers tend to be lazy and give their jobs to other people. That's one of the things from the game. Hobbits love pies, which is something Tolkien never wrote about. So there's actually lore being created in the game that is kind of, feeding back to the root story. And, we've seen that with the movies as well, where I see all the time with folks with Tolkien, and I even sometimes forget, was that in the movie or the book? Did Gandalf say that in the movie or was it in the book? Sort of thing, or the you shall not pass thing, which he never said actually verbatim in the book. So it's been really interesting for me to see that. And I think, for Lord of the Rings Online, like I said, it's not so much an individual player creating that, but it's the body, it's the population, it's the community of players have, we have sort of standing jokes about, and there's also jokes about particular characters in the game that don't show up in Tolkien, but that we know from the game. So there's this whole other sort of, lore that's kind of cropped up as a result of the players having their experience of the game. And I don't know that answers Matthew's question, but hopefully he'll tell us whether that does or not.
Okay, just another little comment from Phil Boswell talking about Figwit, and he says that's Brett from Flight of the Conchords, which of course it is.
That's right, I'd forgotten that. Somebody had told me that and I forgot about that. That's hilarious.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so Sarah Lagarde has a question for you. And I don't know if you can see the question board yourself, Trish.
I probably can, actually.
You should be able to pop that out as you've been made a presenter, but it's the one question I've left in the board there, and it's quite lengthy, so if you can read it for yourself, right. That's probably useful. Okay. But I'll read it out for the audience at large. It says, which of Tolkien's sometimes a bit contradictory letters, do you reference in your thesis regarding Tolkien's acceptance of adaptations and further development of his worlds? I'm looking now at the September 1954 letter to Naomi Mitchison. Yours is the only comment that I've seen that, besides treating the book as a literature and even taking it seriously, also sees it as an elaborate form of the game of inventing a country, an endless one, because even a committee of experts in different branches could not complete the overall picture.
Little did he know, right? I actually don't think I referred to any of his letters. I'm trying to remember. I may have. Seems like I did have it in my bibliography, so I can't remember. The thing that stuck with me in his letters, and I think that was an excellent quote, and I wish I had remembered that one, but the one that I remember has to do with his reactions to the Zimmerman script for Lord of the Rings, and his statement of staying true to the core. I can't get it exactly right because I don't have it in front of me, but like the core, stay true to the core was what his thing was. I mean, he was even like, what shocked me about that letter was the fact that he was willing for, it's like, get rid of Helm's Deep. Helm's Deep doesn't have that much to do with this, it's like, this is Tolkien writing this? I mean, my God. But his point was that if you think about the core of the story, that's superfluous to the core of the story. And I do think, that's one thing that's interesting, specifically about the areas that I'm talking about with Sara, with Rohan and Dunland. And you think about the fact that the core of that story, of that particular region at the time of Lord of the Rings, is Saruman, is Saruman's impact. They really did stay with that. I think that that quote from his letters was really what I had in mind, when I was thinking about this as an adaptation, where they stay true to the core of each area they go into, the core of the story. But yeah, Sara, geez, I wish I should have sent this to you and had you check it before. You could have reminded me of that quote. I wonder, actually, there was a quote that I used in my thesis that's a derivation of something that Tolkien wrote himself about when he wrote Beowulf and the Critics, and I don't know if I can find it, but it's like all I had to do was switch a couple of words and it applied to the game, and it was straight out of his mouth. Oh, I can't find it now, but where he was talking about the extent of the story, you know, and he was making a assertion about Beowulf that I thought was perfect for Lord of the Rings Online. Unfortunately, of course, I didn't mark that particular passage, so I can't find it now, but I won't waste your time. Sorry.
It's okay. Matthew DeForest is following up on his question. He says, you half answered the question, Trish. You got the context down. How do you analyze and write about things that are half in the text and half in the mind of the players, some of whom have made different choices in the game? The question's up there on the board for you to look at.
I was just looking at it. I'm thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think my assertion in the thesis is that even if the player is coming at it differently, you know, like, for example, coming into one of these stories that I write about, well, there's two things about this. First of all, the way the quests are laid out is, you know, you're pretty much guided as a protagonist of your own story to follow a particular path. So one of the ones I'm thinking about in particular is the story of Athelward, which is one of the traitor to country example in LOTRO. And when you get to the story, you meet him earlier in the game, but when you actually get to the story that shows his betrayal, you've been guided. In other words, there's certain gates you have to get through that you don't get to that story unless you go through those gates. So there is kind of a standardizing of a player experience by doing that. So by the time the player gets to that point, every other player has gone through the same gates. You kind of have the same sort of point of reference, if you will. The other thing, though, is, you know, I don't know. I think you could probably say the same thing about The Tempest or King Lear. You know, the audience member is going to come away with a different view or a different experience of that play from the person standing next to them. I don't know that it's that much different, really, from you know, from that kind of experience, or reading any kind of literature, even reading Lord of the Rings. I mean, Lord knows we've got, you know, who's Tom Bombadil? You know, I mean,
don't go down that
I don't
way.
even go there, but you know what I mean? It's like, it's not a standard experience, no matter where you're talking about. And I think it's true for the game too, maybe even more so, I don't know. But I'm just trying to think if I've ever had any sort of controversial conversations with other players.
Just to take your analogy of the theatre there, not just thinking about it in terms of the audience, but also thinking about it in terms of the players on stage, because you have a core text, but there are different interpretations. I mean, on the globe at the moment is not only gender switched, but also color switched productions of Henry IV Part 1, Part 2, and
interesting.
5, which are, you know, a completely different adaptation. That they're not just simply taking the words and then switching to different people playing them. They're actually playing with that core text and reinterpreting it for the 21st century.
True.
So,
and we've seen Shakespeare, you know, played as if it was in Victorian times, right? I mean, I've seen plays of Much Ado About Nothing where everybody's dressed in Victorian, you know, and it's Victorian type stuff. And then also you get down to, you know, I remember, and I specifically remember this with Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, only because I was paying attention. But like, for example, you know, when Jackson would be directing Freeman in a scene with Bilbo, Freeman would deliver it the same scene 6 different times, all different ways, 6 different ways. And then it was up to Jackson to pick which one he wanted, you know. So, you know, that's true too, you know, which is the actors themselves, it could have a different, you know, or one actor to the next in the same role. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Phil Boswell is just commenting along those lines. He says, well, people watching Richard III would react differently depending on whether they sympathize with York or Lancaster.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Or that, you know, this was a piece of what's the word I'm trying to find? Propaganda. You know, Richard III wasn't as bad, you know, historically, blah, blah, blah. You know, so you bring in what you know, you take your own stuff into the play with you. And I think the same is probably true here, you know, with the game.
Okay, so I have one final question for you before we wrap this up. And it's a question I always like to ask, because obviously you're here at the pinnacle of your Signum career. And yet we have large numbers of people who are either right at the beginning of their Signum journey or are coming towards that moment where they're having to choose what they're going to do with their thesis, etc. So if a student was about to embark on their own thesis process and they asked you for one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, the one that I think of is, I would say do some research on the topic that you think you want to write about before you actually ever tell anybody at Signum what it is you want your thesis to be. I had started out early in my early days of Signum thinking that I wanted to do my thesis on Eowyn, which is absolutely a great topic. I mean, there's a lot to be said, about Eowyn. But when I went and looked at what was already out there, I found that I was probably 10 to 20 years too late, because a lot of really good academics have written some really good stuff about Eowyn. And it wasn't so much that there wasn't more that could be written. I just didn't see what I could bring to the party. There was, I just felt like, while there might be something that I could settle on and that I could go with, and Lord knows there's plenty of research, I wouldn't have had the challenge that I had, trying to find research on Eowyn. But I just felt that it had been treated so thoroughly and so well that I just felt like there was probably something more I could bring to the game, bring to the table. So I switched, and I guess that's kind of my second thing, which is to be flexible, because you may actually run into, as you have picked topic A and you're going down, you're researching, you may find there's something that just totally gets, grabs you. And it's not necessarily the topic you originally were going to talk about, but oh my gosh, this is really something I'm really passionate about, and I think it's something really worth doing. And I would, say that the faculty at Signum are more than willing to have you come back and say, let's talk about this idea instead. Like Corey reminded me when I was first starting out, you better really love your topic, because you're going to be living with it for a while, So I would say don't feel like you have to absolutely go with your first instinct. But I think, in my case, my first instinct actually led me, it's going to lead you to the right spot. So be a little bit more fluid, be flexible, and kind of do a little bit of homework just to see kind of what's already out there in the topic you want to talk about. And then if it still feels right, great. And if something else comes up as you're going through your research and it really turns you on, think about that. Think about shifting. So, and like I said, your faculty person, knowing Sara, will always help you with that.
Absolutely. That is what we are here for.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Trish, before we close this thesis theatre? Is there anything that you haven't been asked that you wanted to be asked, or anything that you just want to
let me look at my notes
on to finish?
Let me just see here if there was anything. I think we covered everything that I wanted to kind of talk about.
Okay, that's good.
I don't want to ruin it for people. They should just go read the thesis.
Absolutely. Available in all good bookstores now.
It is.
Or
it's even on my portfolio site, TrishLambert.com. You can get it on my, it's one of my sample writings.
Free advertising right there.
That's right. That's right.
Obviously, for the benefit of those who are watching us right now, Trish's thesis, along with all the other theses that have gone through this process, are all available on the Signum website. And if you are a student at Signum, then you can go in and select something from the shelf and have a good read of all the wonderful work that our past students have produced at the end of their master's degree journey. And Trish, congratulations. Because
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You worked really hard on this, and like I said, you've been around with Signum for a while, and I'm so happy to be part of this final point of your thesis process. And congratulations so much on passing your master's degree.
And I appreciate you working with me on it. It was a great partnership.
That's wonderful to hear. Kate Neville is saying congratulations, and she's done it in all caps, and she's confirming that she is indeed shouting.
Shouting. Thanks, Kate.
Okay.
Well, those of you that are LOTRO players, I'll see you in the game.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for those of you who aren't yet LOTRO players, maybe you want to think about it.
Yeah, think about it.
Okay, so that brings our thesis theatre to an end. And thank you again so much. Thank you to everybody who has joined us here for this. for this last hour. I hope you all found it interesting and informative. My apologies for the intrusion of first my husband and then the sunshine. The husband was easier got rid of. And thank you so much to Buddha for being so patient as to wait elsewhere.
Yes, as he waits elsewhere. And the dogs even got to be quiet, so that was good.
Absolutely. So in the end, we got there. Okay. So thank you very much again. And till the next Thesis Theatre.
Bye, guys.
Okay. Bye, everybody.